Potenza is a city that touches the clouds, a vertical labyrinth perched high in the jagged mountains of southern Italy. Known as the City of Stairs and Stone, it is a provincial fortress where the winter fog lingers longer than anywhere else, wrapping the medieval arches in a sepulchral shroud. To understand the shadow that fell over this place in the autumn of 1993, one must first understand the weight of its silence. In a community where everyone's gaze is a form of surveillance, the most disturbing secrets are not whispered in the dark. They are hidden in plain sight, protected by the very institutions that should offer sanctuary. On September 12th, the rhythm of a quiet Sunday morning was permanently fractured, exposing a void that would remain open for 17 long years. Elisa Claps was 16 years old, the very portrait of a life yet to be written. She was a girl of intellect and kindness, wearing large glasses that framed a gaze full of ambition. She dreamed of healing others, of a future far beyond the narrow alleys of her hometown. On that morning, she left her family home with a lightness in her step that her brother Gildo would remember as the final echo of their shared innocence. She was dressed for the ritual of the day, a white shirt, a blue cardigan, and the quiet dignity of a daughter who never missed a meal or a confidence. She was walking toward the Church of the Most Holy Trinity, a massive structure of ancient stone that stands at the heart of Potenza's social and spiritual life. She believed she was going to a meeting of politeness, unaware that the architecture of the sacred was about to be transformed into an architecture of the eternal. The person awaiting her was Danilo Restivo, a young man who existed on the jagged edges of social acceptance. To many, he was simply an awkward figure, the eccentric son of a prominent family with deep institutional roots. But to the young women of Potenza, he was a phantom of the telephone lines and a collector of fragments. Restivo was known for his unsettling habit of trailing behind girls on public transport, wielding a sharp instrument not for violence, but to steal a lock of hair, a trophy of their identity. He was the author of Silent Phone Calls, where the only sound was the breathing of a predator and the haunting, lonely whistle of an Ennio Morricone soundtrack. Elisa knew of his reputation, but her kindness was a weakness he knew how to exploit. He had lured her to the church with the promise of a small gift, a gesture to celebrate her academic success. It was a simple, clumsy trap, set by a mind that viewed human beings as objects to be dismantled and preserved. Elisa entered the heavy wooden doors of the Santissima Trinità, just as the bells were announcing the hour of prayer. The interior was a forest of shadows and incense, where the murmurs of the faithful provided a constant, low-frequency background noise. She was seen entering. She was alive, vibrant, and present. And then, the light was extinguished. She did not walk out into the sunlight of the piazza. She did not return to the Sunday table where her mother, Filomena, was waiting with the patience of 1,000 years. It was as if the very stones of the sanctuary had opened to swallow her whole. While the ritual of the Mass was being performed below, while the incense rose toward the ceiling, and the priest, Don Mimi Sabia, spoke of salvation, a struggle of absolute desperation was occurring just a few meters away. In the house of God, the most intimate form of darkness had found its perfect cover. When the clock struck 1, the Claps family felt the first chill of a nightmare. Elisa was never late. By the afternoon, the city of Potenza responded to their panic with a devastating indifference. The authorities, blinded by a culture of dismissal, chose to see a rebellious teenager rather than a victim. They spoke of a voluntary departure, a fleeting romance, a girl who had simply chosen to vanish. They looked at the agonizing mother and saw a lack of perspective. not the clarity of a maternal instinct that knew her daughter was in the grip of a tragedy. The investigators failed to secure the perimeter. They failed to recognize that the last person to see her, Danilo Restivo, was a man whose history was a map of escalating obsession. Danilo was questioned, but the process was a masterclass in institutional failure. He appeared before the officers with a wound on his hand, a crimson sign he claimed was the result of a fall at a construction site. It was a lie that any clinical eye would have recognized as the slip of a blade against resistance. Yet, he was allowed to return to his home. His clothes, which witnesses described as marked by the traces of a struggle, were never seized. They were washed in a domestic ritual of erasure, the biological evidence flowing into the sewers of the city before it could be analyzed. The church itself remained an iron fortress. Don Mimi Sabia, a man of immense and mysterious influence, refused to allow the sanctuary to be treated as a scene of interest. He guarded the silence of the stone as if it were a holy relic, effectively sealing the truth behind a wall of religious authority and provincial pride. For months, the search was a performance of futility. The police searched the countryside, the lakes, and the abandoned buildings outside the city, while the answer was rotting in the very heart of the center. The Claps family was left to fight a war against a rubber wall, a system that deflected every question and buried every lead. They realized that in Potenza, some names were too heavy to be moved, and some places were too sacred to be scrutinized. Danilo Restivo continued to walk the streets, a predator whose confidence was growing in the fertile soil of judicial incompetence. He watched the family's grief with the detached curiosity of a scientist, protected by the silence of the church and the apathy of the law. The disappearance of Elisa Claps was the birth of a mystery that would transcend borders and decades. It was the moment when the vertical city revealed its darkest layer, a place where a child could vanish in a crowd of worshippers and remain hidden for 17 years. The Sunday of Silence was not an end. It was the prologue to a saga of international noir, a story of a monster who was allowed to migrate, taking his obsessions from the mountains of Basilicata to the gray coasts of England. The light of Elisa was gone, but the shadow she left behind was long, cold, and reaching for the next victim. The labyrinth had been built, and its architect was just beginning his work. To understand the tragedy of Elisa Claps, one must move beyond the cold facts of a disappearance and stare directly into the fractured psyche of the man who was the last to see her in the light. Danilo Restivo was not a criminal mastermind of the type found in cinematic fiction. He was a figure of awkward visibility, a young man who moved through the steep streets of Potenza, wrapped in an aura of disturbing peculiarity that the city chose to label as harmless eccentricity. But beneath the surface of his clumsy social interactions and his heavy, uncoordinated gait lay a compulsively predatory instinct that had been escalating for years. To the casual observer, he was simply the son of a prominent family. His father, the director of the National Library, was a man of immense culture and social weight. In the rigid hierarchy of a southern Italian province, this pedigree acted as a suit of invisible armor. It allowed a predator to nurture his darkness in the fertile soil of respectability, while the warnings of his future acts were dismissed as the growing pains of a misunderstood boy. Restivo's deviations were not a secret to the young women of Potenza. Long before the autumn of 1993, he had earned a nickname that was whispered with a mix of mockery and genuine unease: the Barber. His obsession was not with the person, but with a fragment of their identity, their hair. He was a phantom of the public transport system, a shadow that sat behind schoolgirls on the morning buses. While the vehicles jolted over the uneven stones of the city, Restivo would reach into his pocket for a sharp, metallic instrument. In a moment of silent violation, he would secure a trophy, a single stolen lock of hair, before vanishing into the crowd. To the victims, it was a sudden, chilling realization of being observed and touched by a stranger. To the authorities who received the complaints, it was a nuisance, a prank, an oddity. They failed to understand the noir logic of the predatory mind, that the collection of fragments is often the rehearsal for the collection of a life. The shearing of hair was his way of asserting dominance, a ritualistic signature that marked his victims before he even knew their names. But his campaign of intimidation extended into the most private spaces of the home through the medium of the telephone. In the early 90s, the landline was a bridge into the sanctuary of the family, and Restivo used it to project his breathing into the ears of his targets. He would call in the dead of night, maintaining a heavy, pressurized silence on the other end of the line. Sometimes, he would introduce a cinematic element to his psychological warfare, playing the haunting, melancholic soundtracks of Ennio Morricone. The lonely whistle of "A Fistful of Dollars" would echo in a darkened bedroom, a musical promise that he was watching, that he was waiting, and that he existed in the vacuum of their fear. Elisa Claps had been a recipient of these calls. Her friends had been targeted. It was a pattern of behavior that should have created a fortress of suspicion around him. Yet the institutional memory of Potenza seemed to suffer from a selective amnesia where the Restivo name was concerned. On the morning of September 12th, the escalation reached its final, irreversible peak. When Danilo arrived at the local emergency room at 1:45 p.m., he was a portrait of internal chaos. He presented a small but deep wound on his hand, a crimson sign that spoke of a struggle he was not prepared to admit. His explanation was a masterclass in provincial deception. He claimed he had fallen at a construction site near the city's escalators. To a clinical observer, the nature of the mark suggested the slip of a blade against resistance, the kind of injury sustained when the hand of the aggressor slides down the tool during a fatal act of force. Yet, the medical staff stitched the wound and allowed him to walk back into the sunlight. No one connected the bleeding young man with the 16-year-old girl who had vanished from the Santissima Trinità just hours before. The system did not just fail. It actively facilitated his disappearance back into the shadows of his family's protection. The hours following the encounter in the church were defined by a domestic ritual of erasure. Witnesses who saw Restivo shortly after he left the sanctuary described a man who was disheveled, perspiring, and visibly shaken. Most importantly, his clothing bore the marks of the struggle, crimson traces that mapped the tragedy that had occurred in the church loft. But when he returned home, the evidence met the relentless tide of maternal protection. In a sequence of events that continues to haunt the pursuit of justice, his mother reportedly washed his clothes immediately. The biological traces of Elisa's final moments were dissolved in detergent and water, flowing into the city's drainage system before the police even thought to knock on the door. By the time the investigators arrived, the jersey was clean, the trousers were scrubbed, and the suspect was once again a respectable young man in a clean shirt. Why was the investigation so paralyzed? This is where the Claps case becomes a study in the rubber wall, il muro di gomma. In a city like Potenza, influence is not always about money. It is about the intersection of the church, the state, and the elite families. Danilo's father was a pillar of the community, and his connections reached into the halls of power. The lead priest of the Santissima Trinità, Don Mimi Sabia, was a man who ruled his parish with the iron will of a medieval lord. He was the gatekeeper of the sanctuary, and he treated the suggestion that a tragedy could have occurred within his walls as a personal and spiritual insult. He denied access to investigators. He dismissed the Claps family's pleas for a thorough search, and he maintained a stoic, impenetrable defense of his sacred space. Under his watch, the church became a fortress of silence. The police, deferential to the authority of the cloth and the weight of the Restivo name, conducted a search that was a performance of futility. They looked in the forests, they dragged the lakes, they searched abandoned country houses. They looked everywhere, except for the one place the laws of logic dictated they should look. Up, into the rafters of the very building where she was last seen alive. The weeks that followed were a testament to the sociopathic resilience of the suspect. Danilo did not hide. He walked the piazze of Potenza with a chilling detachment, sometimes even approaching the Claps family to offer a performative sympathy that masked a predatory satisfaction. He relied on his reputation as the awkward boy to deflect the gravity of the accusations, playing a role that the city was all too willing to accept. If he was just an idiot, he couldn't be a monster. But the darkness inside him was growing, fueled by the realization that the system was not his enemy, but his accomplice. The rubber wall was holding firm, and every accusation from the Claps family bounced back, leaving them isolated in their grief while the predator continued to move through the streets, his shearing instruments still in his pocket, his Morricone tapes still ready to play. Gildo Claps, Elisa's brother, began his own investigation. A lonely crusade against the collective silence of a city that wanted to forget. He realized that the disappearance was not just an act of violence by one man, but a collective act of negligence by an entire community. The investigators' notes were filled with contradictions that were never explored. The timing of Danilo's movements was never properly challenged. The scent of the church attic, the scent of a secret rotting in the dark, was ignored by those who came to pray. The vertical city was keeping its secret, and for 17 years, the life of a 16-year-old girl would be treated as a cold file, an inconvenient memory that the powerful hoped would eventually dissolve into the mountain mist. But Danilo Restivo was a bomb that the Italian authorities had failed to defuse. As the pressure in Potenza finally began to mount, years too late, the suspect made a move that would transform the case into an international noir. He migrated. He took his obsessions, his rituals, and his hidden history and transported them to the gray, rainy coast of England. In the town of Bournemouth, he believed he could start again, a man with a clean slate in a country where no one knew the name Restivo or the story of the girl in the church. He did not know that the shadow of Elisa was following him across the sea, and he did not know that his need for the ritual would soon demand another sacrifice. The Sunday of silence in Potenza was over, but the nocturnal chaos of Danilo Restivo was about to find a new stage, and this time, the world would finally be forced to look into the abyss he had created. Bournemouth is a town that lives on the edge of the English Channel, a place of Victorian piers, sandy beaches, and a persistent gray drizzle that seems to wash away the colors of the world. In the late 90s, it became the chosen sanctuary for Danilo Restivo. To the residents of Chatsworth Road, he was just an unusual neighbor, a man who had moved from Italy, married a local woman, and lived a life of quiet, almost invisible routine. He believed that by crossing the Alps and the sea, he had left the ghost of Elisa Claps behind in the mountains of Basilicata. He believed that the silence of the Santissima Trinità was a permanent shield. But the noir heart does not change its rhythm simply because it has changed its geography. The obsession that had driven him in the narrow alleys of Potenza was not dead. It was merely hibernating, waiting for the right atmosphere to re-emerge in a more devastating form. In November 2002, the suburban tranquility of Bournemouth was shattered by a discovery that mirrored the darkest chapters of the Italian dossier. Heather Barnett was a 48-year-old mother, a skilled seamstress who lived across the street from the man the English would soon come to know as the Italian neighbor. Heather was a pillar of her small community, a woman of warmth and industry. But on that cold afternoon, her children returned home to find a scene that defied the logic of human empathy. Heather had been subjected to a final act of overwhelming force in her own home. The interior, which should have been a place of safety, had been transformed into a theater of the macabre. The authorities arrived to find a choreography of darkness that suggested the perpetrator was not merely a criminal, but a ritualist. The most chilling detail of the scene was not the violence itself, but what had been left behind, or rather, what had been arranged. In a terrifying echo of the whispers from Potenza, the victim had been marked by a specific, fetishistic signature. Locks of hair, which did not belong to Heather, had been placed with surgical precision in her hands. It was the shearing of identity, a trophy of the scalp used as a final, mocking ornament. To the Dorset police, this was a baffling, unprecedented detail. They were looking for a motive in the mundane, a robbery, a domestic dispute, a random intruder. But the scene spoke of an ancient, obsessive need for control. It spoke of a predator who had practiced this moment many times before in his mind, and perhaps in reality. The investigation, led by Detective Inspector Phil James, quickly turned toward the quiet man across the street. Danilo Restivo's behavior during the initial inquiries was a study in sociopathic detachment. He offered a narrative of helpfulness, yet his eyes remained as cold as the English winter. He claimed he had been out that morning, following a series of disjointed errands that left his timeline full of convenient gaps. But as the detectives looked closer, the rubber wall that had protected him in Italy began to crumble under the weight of British procedural rigor. They found a man who possessed a collection of shearing instruments, a man whose computer was a digital archive of dark obsessions. But most importantly, they found the link to the past, the connection between the gray streets of Bournemouth and the vertical city of Potenza was forged when the Dorset police contacted their Italian counterparts. The file on Elisa Claps, which had been gathering dust in a basement for nearly a decade, was suddenly thrust into the international spotlight. The similarities were too precise to be a coincidence. The obsession with hair, the silent phone calls, the proximity of the suspect to the last sighting of the victim. The Barber of Potenza had become the butcher of Bournemouth. Yet the legal paradox remained. In England, they had a fresh scene but circumstantial evidence. In Italy, they had a suspect but no body. The two cases were like two halves of a broken mirror, neither able to show the full reflection without the other. As the years passed without an arrest, the psychological pressure on Chatsworth Road became almost unbearable. Restivo remained free, a shadow that moved among his neighbors, watching them with the same predatory curiosity he had shown in the piazze of his youth. The Dorset police, refusing to repeat the mistakes of the Potenza authorities, placed him under constant surveillance. They watched as he took long walks into the wooded areas of Oakhaven, carrying a change of clothes and his metallic tools. They watched as he sat on park benches, his eyes scanning the back of women's heads, his hand moving toward his pocket in a phantom rehearsal of the snip. He was a monster in a cage of surveillance, but he was still a monster. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Elisa Claps and the Association Libera were fighting a war of attrition against the institutional silence. They knew that the key to Heather Barnett's case was buried somewhere in Potenza, and they knew that the key to Elisa's disappearance was likely still inside the stone walls of the Santissima Trinità. The priest, Don Mimi Sabia, had died, taking his secrets to a grave that was more honored than the one Elisa had been denied. The church remained a fortress, a place where prayer was used as a barrier to the truth. But the international pressure was building. The story was no longer a provincial secret. It was a global noir narrative about the migration of evil and the failure of those sworn to protect the innocent. The final collision between the two worlds occurred when advanced forensic techniques allowed for a new reading of the English scene. A microscopic trace, a single biological signature found on a piece of evidence, pointed directly to the neighbor. At the same time, the walls of the church in Potenza were beginning to sweat with the weight of the truth. The first act of this tragedy concludes with the arrest of Danilo Restivo in Bournemouth, a moment of triumph for the English detectives, but a moment of profound, agonizing tension for the Claps family. The architect of the nightmare was finally behind bars, but the most important question remained unanswered. As the screen fades to black on this first chapter, we are left with the image of a man in a cell, his scissors finally taken away, his Morricone tapes silent. He has been convicted of the fatal act in England, the judge labeling him a cold-blooded killer who would never be free again. But in the heart of Potenza, the wind still whistles through the arches of the Santissima Trinità, and the family of Elisa Claps still looks at a photograph of a 16-year-old girl who never came home. The monster is caught, but the tomb is still hidden. The labyrinth of the body and the altar has one final, horrifying layer yet to be revealed. A secret that has been waiting in the dark for 17 years, just above the heads of those who come to ask for God's mercy.